Let me be direct with you from the outset because the situation unfolding in the Bab el Mandeb Strait demands directness. What we are witnessing is not a Houthi rebellion. It is not a regional proxy conflict. What we are witnessing is the systematic transformation of global maritime trade executed by a force that Western media has spent 2 years portraying as incapable of strategic planning. I am looking at shipping data compiled by Lloyd's List Intelligence that has been circulating among maritime insurance analysts for the past 96 hours. What it shows is not a temporary disruption. It is not a series of random attacks. What it shows is a 73% reduction in container traffic through one of the world's most critical choke points, sustained now for 14 consecutive months, with no indication of reversal. The economic displacement alone exceeds $280 billion in rerouted cargo. The insurance premium increases have made certain routes commercially non-viable regardless of security conditions. In the next 20 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why Yemen has achieved what Iran never could in the Strait of Hormuz, why this represents the most successful maritime interdiction campaign since World War II, and why the effects are showing up in your grocery bills whether you realize it or not. This is the geopolitical reality that mainstream coverage has fundamentally mischaracterized. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is being actively analyzed by Pentagon strategists, European defense ministries, and Chinese economic planners. You are not getting this level of analysis from CNN, MSNBC, or Fox News. Let's start with the geography because it explains everything that follows. The Bab el Mandeb Strait sits at the southern entrance to the Red Sea, connecting the Indian Ocean to the Suez Canal. At its narrowest point, the strait measures just 29 kilometers wide. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the distance between Manhattan and Newark. A single missile fired from the Yemeni coast has a flight time of approximately 90 seconds to reach a vessel in the shipping lane. The entire width of the strait falls within the range of even the most basic anti-ship missiles. Approximately 12% of global trade passes through this corridor. That includes roughly 30% of global container shipping between Asia and Europe. It includes 8% of global liquefied natural gas traffic. Before the current situation began in November 2023, an average of 57 commercial vessels transited the strait daily. That number has now dropped to fewer than 16. The vessels that do transit are predominantly Chinese flagged or operating under insurance waivers that acknowledge the risk as unmanageable through normal coverage. According to the International Maritime Organization, the average additional voyage time for cargo rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope is 21 days. That is 3 weeks of additional fuel consumption, crew wages, and capital tied up at sea. The fuel cost alone adds between $400,000 and $2 million per voyage depending on vessel size. Container shipping rates from Shanghai to Rotterdam increased by 256% in the first 6 months of the interdiction campaign. Those costs do not evaporate. They embed themselves in the price of every manufactured good that travels that route. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of economic analysis from the headlines. Now let's talk about what Yemen actually built. Announcement number 1, the anti-ship ballistic missile capability. And this one matters more than anything else because it represents a weapons technology that only 5 nations on Earth have successfully deployed in combat. The United States, Russia, China, Iran, and now Yemen. The missiles in question are domestically modified versions of Iranian Qatar and Qaem systems, reconfigured for local manufacturing and extended range. The Yemeni forces have demonstrated the ability to strike vessels at distances exceeding 180 kilometers from launch points along their coastline. Commander Michael Gilday, former Chief of Naval Operations for the United States Navy, acknowledged publicly in congressional testimony that these systems pose a credible threat to commercial and military vessels alike. The missiles do not need to sink ships to be effective. A single strike that disables propulsion or navigation systems renders a vessel non-operational in a hostile waterway. The economic loss from a damaged container ship can exceed $400 million when you account for hull damage, cargo loss, salvage operations, and scheduled disruption across global supply chains. Yemen currently operates an estimated 30 to 40 of these missile launchers, dispersed across rugged terrain that makes targeting exceptionally difficult. That number matters because it exceeds the capacity of any defensive system to simultaneously track and intercept saturation attacks. A coordinated salvo of even 6 missiles fired at a single vessel cluster overwhelms current point defense systems aboard commercial ships, which typically have no missile defense capability whatsoever. Even naval escorts struggle with multiple simultaneous threats. According to reporting by Bloomberg and confirmed by multiple Western maritime security firms, Yemeni forces have executed over 90 attacks on commercial and military vessels since November 2023. That averages to more than 2 attacks per week, sustained across 14 months. The consistency demonstrates logistical depth, not opportunistic harassment. Received, that is announcement number one. Announcement number two, the drone swarm coordination. This is the part that U.S. Central Command has confirmed, but mainstream media consistently underreports. Yemen has deployed unmanned aerial vehicles and unmanned surface vehicles in coordinated packages that force defensive systems to allocate resources across multiple threat vectors simultaneously. The drones themselves are relatively unsophisticated, modified commercial quadcopters carrying explosive payloads between 5 and 20 kilograms. But sophistication is not the point, volume is the point. A swarm of 12 drones approaching from different altitudes and vectors creates a target saturation problem that no ship-based defense system is designed to handle efficiently. You must engage all threats. You cannot assume any single drone is a decoy. U.S. Navy destroyers operating in the Red Sea have expended SM-2 and SM-6 interceptor missiles valued at approximately $1 million each to down drones that cost perhaps $2,000 to manufacture. The cost-exchange ratio is catastrophic. One naval analyst described it to Defense News as using a sledgehammer to kill a mosquito, except the mosquitoes keep coming and you eventually run out of sledgehammers. U.S. vessels have been forced to return to port multiple times to rearm their vertical launch systems. That creates gaps in defensive coverage. The unmanned surface vehicles represent an even more challenging problem. These are remote-controlled or autonomous boats loaded with explosives, essentially seaborne improvised explosive devices capable of speeds exceeding 40 knots. Detection is difficult because their radar signature mimics small fishing vessels which are ubiquitous in these waters. By the time a crew identifies a USV as hostile, engagement windows are measured in seconds. Stay with me because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the strategic intent becomes impossible to ignore. Announcement number three, and this one, almost nobody in the mainstream media is connecting correctly. The target selection pattern reveals deliberate economic strategy, not random aggression. Yemeni forces have not attacked every vessel in the strait. They have attacked vessels linked to Israeli ownership, Israeli destinations, or nations participating in military operations supporting Israel. Chinese vessels transit unmolested. Russian vessels transit unmolested. Even many European vessels operating under specific flags have been allowed passage. This is not indiscriminate terrorism. This is conditional interdiction. It functions as a maritime blockade enforced through selective violence, achieving the economic objective without requiring total closure of the waterway. The message is clear: comply with our political demands or accept unsustainable economic costs. Reroute your cargo or reroute your policy. The reason insurance companies withdrew coverage from certain shipping routes is the same reason airlines avoid active war zones. The actuarial math becomes impossible. When the probability of a successful attack exceeds the threshold, where premiums would need to be higher than the value of the cargo itself, the route becomes commercially uninsurable. That threshold was crossed in January 2024. Multiple major insurers, including Lloyd's of London syndicates, issued guidance that vessels transiting the southern Red Sea without naval escort would be considered high risk or uninsurable under standard maritime policies. The geopolitical implications extend beyond the immediate conflict. What Yemen has demonstrated is that a non-state actor with modest resources can impose strategic costs on global trade flows that rival the impact of state-level naval powers. This is asymmetric warfare adapted to the maritime domain. The cost to maintain the interdiction campaign is minuscule compared to the cost imposed on the global economy. Estimates suggest Yemen spends perhaps $50 to $100 million annually on the weapon systems involved. The global economic impact exceeds $280 billion. That is a 2,800 to 1 cost exchange ratio. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now let's talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are two stories playing out simultaneously, and the mainstream media is only covering one of them. The first story is the one you hear repeatedly: Houthi rebels backed by Iran launching reckless attacks on international shipping. Terrorism on the high seas. The international community must respond. The United States and United Kingdom have conducted multiple rounds of airstrikes against Yemeni positions to degrade their capabilities and restore freedom of navigation. The second story, the one you are not hearing, is that those airstrikes have comprehensively failed to achieve their stated objectives. Despite hundreds of strikes on launch sites, weapons depots, and command facilities, the attack tempo has not decreased. In some months, it has increased. The infrastructure targeted by coalition airstrikes is either rapidly reconstituted or was never critical to operational capacity in the first place. Mobile launchers hide in mountainous terrain. Drones are assembled in distributed workshops. The supply chain runs through routes that coalition intelligence has proven unable to interdict consistently. The United States responded by deploying additional naval assets to the region, carrier strike groups, destroyer squadrons, amphibious ready groups. The cost of maintaining this force structure in theater exceeds $1 billion per month when you account for operational expenses, munitions expenditure, and wear on platforms. And what has it achieved? Shipping companies are still rerouting around Africa. Insurance premiums remain prohibitively high. The flow of global trade has not been restored. Think carefully about what this represents. When the United States conducts sustained military operations, deploys overwhelming conventional firepower, and coordinates with allied nations, and the situation on the ground does not measurably improve after 14 months, that is not ambiguity. That is not a work in progress. That is a strategic failure. European allies have been even more reluctant. France, Germany, and Italy initially committed naval assets to a European-led operation called ASPIDES, designed to protect commercial shipping. The operation has provided convoy escorts for select vessels, but has not deterred attacks. Several European shipping companies have publicly stated that even with naval escort, the insurance liability and crew safety concerns make the route economically non-viable. When asked whether Aspides has succeeded in restoring normal commercial traffic, a senior EU official told Reuters that the goal was not restoration, but mitigation. That is diplomatic language for we cannot solve this problem. If you operate a business with any import component from Asia, what is happening in the Bab el Mandeb is not a foreign policy story. It is a cost of goods sold story. Those 21 additional days of shipping time translate directly into inventory carrying costs, delayed product launches, and either absorbed margin loss or price increases passed to consumers. The appliances in your home, the electronics on your desk, the clothing in your closet. If any of it was manufactured in Asia and shipped to Europe or the eastern United States, there is a high probability it was either rerouted at significant cost or delayed substantially. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same. The Peloponnesian War. Athens and Sparta, the two dominant powers of the Greek world, went to war. 27 years. Both sides exhausted themselves. Thousands dead. Economies shattered. And who won? Persia. Persia, which had been defeated by the Greeks 50 years earlier, quietly rebuilt its strength while the Greek city-states tore each other apart. By the time the war ended, Persia was the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean, and Greece never recovered its former strength. Yemen is not Persia in this analogy, but the principle is exact. While the United States and its allies expend resources, political capital, and strategic focus on an interdiction campaign they cannot suppress, China continues its economic expansion. The Belt and Road Initiative does not pause. Chinese shipyards continue building the world's largest commercial fleet. Chinese trade with the global south continues growing. The United States is spending billions to protect a shipping route that increasingly carries Chinese goods to European markets. Think about that. So where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 clear paths because there is no honest middle ground here. Path 1, diplomatic resolution. Yemen agrees to cease attacks in exchange for political concessions related to the Gaza conflict and sanctions relief. Israel agrees to a ceasefire that Yemen recognizes as credible. International guarantees are provided. This path requires political will that has not been demonstrated by any party involved thus far. It also requires Yemen to trust that agreements will be honored, which, given the history of broken ceasefires in this region, represents a substantial leap of faith. Likelihood assessment, possible but improbable without significant external pressure. Path 2, military escalation. The United States and coalition partners dramatically increase the scale and scope of strikes, targeting not just launch sites, but the broader political and military infrastructure of Yemen. This risks further destabilizing an already fragmented country, potentially creating power vacuums that extremist groups exploit. It also risks drawing Iran more directly into the conflict, which opens scenarios that no rational planner wants to contemplate. And critically, it has no guarantee of success. You cannot bomb an idea, and the idea that Yemen can impose costs on nations supporting policies it opposes has now been validated by 14 months of demonstrated capability. Path 3, economic adaptation. Global shipping routes permanently adjust. The Cape of Good Hope becomes the primary corridor for certain trade flows. New infrastructure investments are made in African ports to handle increased traffic. Supply chains are reconfigured to account for longer transit times as the new normal. Insurance models are rebuilt around sustained maritime risk in specific corridors. This path is already underway. It does not require agreement or military victory. It simply requires acceptance that the world has changed. I think we are closer to path 3 than the headlines suggest. The commercial decisions being made by shipping companies, logistics firms, and insurance underwriters reflect a judgment that this situation is durable, not temporary. When major European retailers begin signing contracts with African port authorities for expanded warehousing, that is not a contingency plan, that is a strategic shift. But here is the part that should concern anyone paying attention. If a non state actor in one of the poorest countries on earth can achieve this level of strategic impact with relatively modest resources, what does that mean for other choke points? The Strait of Hormuz carries 21% of global oil traffic. The Strait of Malacca carries 25% of traded goods. The Turkish straits control access to the Black Sea. Each of these waterways has potential actors with grievances, capabilities, and motivations. The era of uncontested maritime dominance by Western naval powers may be ending not through peer competitor naval expansion, but through proliferation of asymmetric capabilities that make the cost of maintaining control prohibitively expensive. Here are the questions I want you to take away. If the United States cannot suppress a maritime interdiction campaign after 14 months of sustained effort, what does that signal to other actors considering similar strategies? If insurance markets can make a route commercially non-viable regardless of military protection, who actually controls global trade? And if supply chains are being permanently reconfigured around instability in a single strait, what does that mean for the economic assumptions underpinning globalization itself? Tell me in the comments what you think the end state looks like for the Bab el Mandeb situation. Tell me if you think path 2 escalation becomes more likely or if path 3 adaptation is already locked in. We will keep tracking every development in Yemen, the Red Sea corridor, and the broader geopolitical implications of this sustained interdiction campaign. That is what this analysis does every single day. Subscribe now, share this with everyone in your network who is trying to understand why shipping costs increased or why certain products are harder to find. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next breakdown, and we will see you in the next analysis.